I don't know about you, but even when I make these videos and I read the content and I watch the TikToks and watch YouTube and read books, I sometimes feel overwhelmed by what it takes to heal. And one of the things I struggle with here and in any content making format is that people will often say, well, what's the solution, And the truth is that most of these things require sometimes a combination of time, not saying like time heals all wounds, but just saying that as time goes by, we start to make connections, we're doing therapy perhaps, we're journaling, we're having new relationships, we're grieving, we are participating in courses and books and listening to podcasts, and every single one of us shifts differently. And I made that video just the other day about being motherless, and it's always amazing to me like what things come up for people that watch my videos. And like I said, I don't really have the best strategies, probably like I should, but I try to just make content more often than not that is like, well, what do I wish someone would say? Or it is often comes out of a process. Like I shared, I was in therapy. And I told my therapist the other day about that video. And she was like, oh, well, I'm glad that, through you, it's also helping other people. But it's like, it's hard to heal and it can be overwhelming. And I also wanted to share the video about adult complex PTSD because in my experience of being motherless, in my childhood, I had a certain version of my mom. But in my adulthood, I had another one. And they were similar and yet distinctively different, and how they hurt me. And people also watch this channel and they'll say, oh, you're blaming mothers and all that, and I just don't believe that. I know that being a parent is the hardest job on the planet. I have 4 children and they've struggled and I've struggled, and so I just want to acknowledge that it's not so simple, although I do think knowledge heals, and time and reflection and therapy and books and all those things, right? But that what I also know that matters is feeling seen and heard and knowing that you're not alone. In so much of my story, I felt like, well, I knew this wasn't normal, but I didn't know anybody else whose parents treated me, them the way my parents treated me. And so it's hard. I just want to acknowledge that, like, I know it's hard. So I want to talk about healing complex PTSD, when the adult wounding happens, as you are an adult with a parent, a partner, whatever it is, but I'm often talking about the wounds of parents, as you know, on my channel. So there are 5 common struggles, I think. There are so many, but 5 of the biggest struggles we have when we have parents who have what I've called eggshell patterns, roller coaster patterns, who fit the category of disorganized attachment, who may have undiagnosed qualities or traits that are, related to things like borderline or narcissism, immaturity, whatever it is. Number 1, the first thing is that splitting is normal, meaning that black or white thinking, you're all good, you're all bad, the world is all good or all bad, people, everything gets kind of like split, because that is what parents who really struggle with the kind of like inconsistencies often struggle with their own emotional dysregulation. And so because they often split, I love you this morning, you're the bad child tonight, you were the best daughter ever, now you're the worst, I'm going to call you the worst names ever. Even in your adult life, we can take that on and we can see ourselves in those terms. I'm good or bad, and other people are good or bad or right or wrong. And that is really important to challenge yourself on. Number 2, that anxious and avoidant swings are normal, right? So like we can have these massive fears of engulfment. You're going to consume me, followed by or, related to the next moment or day, fears of you leaving us, of being abandoned, because of that push-pull, that dynamic where the source of safety is often the source of fear, which is the heart of disorganized attachment, alongside over-involvement in the caretaker state of mind. So we're learning to read mind and mood. We're constantly hypervigilant about all of those things. And so when it comes to our own relationships, we can have real difficulty with the longing for finally being loved, being someone's priority. And yet the reality is, in our bodies and in our stories, in our minds, when we were supposed to be someone's priority, it wasn't safe. And so I do think it follows that if your primary caregivers were not safe, it's really hard to fully show up in relationships, believing that without doing some kind of work, reflection, things like that. Number 3, isolating is very common to deal with our nervous system, and that can really relate to avoidant dynamics, but that the only way we feel safe is when we are alone. And that would be maybe playing alone in our rooms, or when we left the same town we grew up in, but we might find that we isolate more than we'd like to. Now, if you love being alone, as I've talked about, that's one thing. But when it is you feel like you don't know how to not be alone, but you're lonely. See, I don't feel a lot of loneliness, but I've also been raising so many kids with full custody my whole life. I think I will feel that more as my last one leaves the nest in the next couple of years. But I'm still, wanting to be involved in my kids' lives and all of that. So the bottom line is, though, when I'm alone, if I felt just like desperately lonely, that would be different. And I think that it's probably going to be more likely to feel lonely when I don't have a life that's so full. But my point is that oftentimes we don't know how to be except for with other people and completely isolated, because that's the only way we know how to feel safe in our nervous systems. That's that kind of trying to manage our dysregulation. Number 4, that no one is safe, that we must distrust everyone. I think this is, like I was saying, all together. And lastly, that I am unlovable and everything is my fault. When people are mad at me, it's because I did something wrong. When someone has strong emotions, it's my fault. Even though we can know up here it's not, it can feel like it. It can be really difficult for us to tolerate distress in other people, let alone in ourselves. So all of that, I think, at a minimum, I could go on, manifests in what I think you have to hold on to as you're trying to fix all of those things, like it's just, fixable, but you know what I mean? Like, as you're working on those things, I should say, is a much better choice of words, to heal adult Cptsd. So number 1, I'm going to presume, let's just make a case study out of this, that you have a parent in your life or parents who are emotionally unsafe. They're great, they're not great. There's something happening where you're not out of contact with them. You can't be out of contact. You don't want to be for whatever reason, but you're stuck in a really hurtful cycle. The one I was referring to, describing really what my adult 20s, 30s, and 40s, and almost in my 50s looked like with my mom before I decided to change that relationship on my part. So let's use that as the case example. So number 1, if I was talking to myself then, okay, and this isn't really how therapy works in this regard, but let's pretend it's like, here are the steps. Number 1, I would say, look, you have to identify what is going on, like the patterns, the toxicity, and you have to admit out loud and in your heart that it hurts you, that it breaks you, that it makes you sad, that it makes you angry. You have to acknowledge it. Number 2, you have to stop making excuses. Well, they were traumatized too. Well, they had a bad marriage. Well, they lost all their money. Like, all of those things were true about my mom, but it didn't justify the wounding, okay? So it doesn't mean you can't have compassion and hold a space for their trauma and say, under these circumstances, I will try to give more grace, but you cannot continue to say that they can be hurtful to you because they can't help it because of their trauma. You can, but you can't heal with that. And nothing is going to change for you if you don't acknowledge that and start saying, no matter what, it's not okay for you to call me names, for you to withhold love, for you to, stonewall me, for you to talk bad about me to my kids, whatever it is, or my partner. Number 3, you have to try to have compassion for the child within you, the little parts of you that the reason why you've stayed in this is because you so long to be seen and protected and loved and safe. So while you're kind of growing that adult protective self, it's important to hold to the child self, to hold to it and say, but I understand why you've done this, not to shame yourself more. Like, what's wrong with you? They treat you badly. Why can't you stop doing this? It takes them holding the parts, the part of you that's hurt and the part that wants to be kind of more empowered. Number 4, go to therapy if you can. I know that it is not for everyone. I know it is certainly not accessible or affordable. But if you have the chance to participate in a therapy group, maybe that's cheaper, to watch videos, to learn, to go to therapy, whatever it is, any way you can, books, podcasts, resources, courses, everything you can, try to get external support. And if the support you're getting isn't working, then even though I know that it is so hard to find someone and it is so hard to change, at some point you're not going to have that growth. And so try and do whatever you can. Maybe it is all you can do is, if you can even go to the library these days and get a book and read, that's okay. Most self-help books have exercises. I'm not saying that that's going to fix everything, but a lot of times, or videos, we're giving you ideas and steps. But also it's a process. Like I said earlier, you can't just like line things up and fix them, but there is something that happens inside the more you're leaning in to your hurt, to your goals, to your dreams, to the pain, to the anger, whatever that is. Number 5, read a book like Pete Walker's book on Cptsd. That book really changed my life in understanding the damage of the relational trauma. If you happen to say my parents do seem to have that more eggshell quality, I would say read books like Stop Walking on Eggshells, Surviving a Borderline Parent, Mothers Who Can't Love, Mother Hunger, Emotionally Immature Parents. What is the one I'll have to list down below for narcissistic mothers and narcissistic parents? I mean, try to get a grasp of what has really happened to you from your perspective, regardless of what anyone else thinks. What are the pieces that are coming up? And then take notes, journal, let it emerge. Oh yeah, I do think I had Cptsd, or I have it. Oh yeah, I do think my parent has this issue and I feel bad that they have it, but I need to understand that, like I said, where I think labels help is when they give us permission to say, this is not my fault, right? So it's not saying you have this and that's what's wrong with you, although you're entitled to your anger and to say that. Just don't say it online, I would say, but you're allowed to feel that. But also what I found it has done, and there was a place and there is still a place sometimes for anger, but what it really did when I was able to identify my mom having borderline was I was like, this explains it. And this is not my fault. I really am not the bad child that she keeps telling me that I am. So without pathologizing, but with understanding, if that makes sense. Number, 6, decide what level of boundaries you want to start engaging in. So ideally you try to heal the relationship, right? You have talks, you say your feelings, they say their feelings, they apologize, they repair, you reconnect, best case scenario. But for many parents, they are not going to do that. They're going to refuse to do that. And they can be very threatened by you trying to just go to therapy and work on your issues, even if you don't involve them and try to ask them to come to therapy with you. By the way, if your parents are undiagnosed with a disorder like narcissism, therapy is going to feel really threatening. And it can also be very damaging for you, as it kind of can cause a reenactment of your trauma. The best part about that is if you have a good therapist, the therapist can help you make sense of that. But just be mindful. But if they're willing to go and you feel like there's a possibility that there could be some healing, I think it's worth the gamble, as long as it is an emotionally safe enough experience, and only you can decide that. So the next thing would often be, a surface relationship, setting really firm boundaries. And then lastly, we often end up going to no contact if nothing else works. That is only if nothing else works. No one chooses to not discuss their life or have a relationship with a parent for no reason, in my experience. I'm not saying it's always the parent's fault. Sometimes kids have their own struggles, mental health, addiction, and a lot of times parents are like, look, I've done all I can. So I am not saying that if it's just like this, it's your fault. There can be lots of reasons. It can be a combination. But you have to figure out at some point, just like what we talk about enabling addicts, like at what point can I detach with love? And that may be what you have to do, and that will have to be decided by you and your therapist or your partner or whoever, or just you. But make sure you start to identify what your goals are. Maybe you make outlines about, okay, I'm going to try this. If that doesn't work, I'll try this. But also be clear about what your non-negotiables are. For example, I will no longer allow my parent to verbally abuse me, something like that. Number 7, I won't go to holidays anymore. We'll just visit once a year, or I'll make phone calls every few weeks. I'll stop talking every day to them. That's often a huge issue. Number 7, identify signs you are slipping again. So one of the hardest things to do when you do this work is, like I said, even when I was in Paris and I had all these things come up, I was like, wait a minute, why am I not talking to her again? I mean, 5 years later, we're so wired to want to be in connection with our parents. That is why we don't go no contact for no reason. We want to be loved and seen, and we want to love and see our parents. But what happens is you start to get lost in the story, you get distracted, your hurt emerges, you feel lonely for them, it's the holidays, whatever. So it's good to identify kind of like what the hallmarks and signs are of things that might be, look, you're letting things go again too much. You're dismissing hurtful things. You're letting them talk to you this way. You're getting over involved in solving their problems, things like that. Number 8, start taking responsibility for reparenting yourself. And that goes back to kind of what I was saying about the inner child inside. But to understand that there will never be another parent for you at this point in life. You are the only parent you will have. And you have to tell yourself what's okay, what's not okay. When you're not taking care of yourself, when you need to go to bed earlier, right? When you need to stop missing out on the doctor's appointments, things like that. So you have to start to own that. No one's going to swoop in and start to reparent you. Even the greatest partners who can do a lot to help heal attachment wounds, at the end of the day, they're not meant to be your parent. They are stand-ins for parents, but they're not going to be able to fully heal that. It's a combination. Would that be great to have a safe, loving relationship? But don't let that become their burden. You have to share that kind of burden of healing together. Number 9, do your grief work. Cry, listen to sad music, watch sad movies. If you haven't worked on really letting yourself feel the weight of the sadness. And it might come and go. I mean, I still feel, waves of grief at certain moments, birthdays, holidays, trips, when bad things happen, scary things, when I feel lonely. It's really important to let yourself go through that. And ideally, if you can do it through journaling, through therapy, that's, like I'm saying, that's the best way. And it's not just a stop and start, but honor that there's going to be grief. And there may be a lot of unpurged grief that is really in need of being seen and healed and heard. Number 10, work on your trauma, right? So what kind of trauma? Well, oftentimes most of us have Cptsd from the relational trauma with these parents, and then because of their lack of safety, we have PTSD from singular events. Remember, complex trauma, complex PTSD is about relational trauma, and PTSD is more often single events or single event experiences, like going to a war, right? Or like a robbery, something like that. So that may be, like I said, going back to the books, doing therapy, but you have to honor and look at and try to work towards the trauma that often lives in your body, that's the nervous system dynamic, and in your story, in how you make sense of yourself and others in the world and relationships. I have cat hair, as usual, everywhere. Number 11, look at how you may be acting out your trauma with your partners. So it's very common for us to say, I'm never choosing a partner like mom or dad or parent, and then to end up somehow in a relationship, a marriage, with or without children, or long-term relationships, with someone who at the beginning looked nothing like a parent, but that brings up the same feelings of abandonment, of avoidance, of loss, things like that. And what's often helpful for that is to read books on attachment, right? To look at books on relationships. Sometimes that can help. Go to therapy if you can together, or read a couple's therapy book just together and talk about it. Do the exercises. I think people often really skip the exercises in books, and I get why. I do too a lot. But I do think that there can be a lot of good self-reflections there. Number 12, look at how you may be reenacting the experiences with your parents on yourself. So going back to how I was talking about feeling deprived, how I keep myself from, how I have getting the kind of all the extra things, like taking care of doctor's appointments on time, the dentist, buying myself something that I care about for my birthday, or taking myself to do something, or taking a nap, or just laying down and not just 90 miles an hour working. So oftentimes, whatever you felt in childhood, like you weren't worthy, you were bad, you're unlovable, you don't deserve good things, we often just create that story in our own lives, and no one can change that story but you. And then lastly, examine the potential both in yourself and your partners for traits or subclinical traits or dynamics, or even a disorder of things that could be actually living inside you. Like if you had a narcissistic parent or a narcissistic family system, it may be that sometimes you have those traits of narcissism in yourself because that is the only way you learned to get your needs met. well, I have to only focus on myself, right? Or maybe it is that in your inability to manage your emotions because you had a very highly dysregulated parent who had a really hard time with relationships and emotions and mood and feelings and consistency, which may or may not be common in certain disorders. You might have those things too, and so you don't know how to deal with your feelings because the only model you had was one that blew, or one that shut down, and you don't really know how to manage things. Or maybe you think, you know what, I actually think I also may have borderline, or I also have a lot of work to do on this issue. It's okay, right? The thing is, people that have these true, difficulties really have a hard time with insight. And so you're probably not there completely, but even if you are, especially for something like borderline, there are so many great treatments and forms of help in therapy than there ever have been before. So even if you're like feeling like, yeah, that is me, please don't use that to judge and shame yourself. If you're like, oh, my parent that I'm struggling with had that too, you have a different experience and you have a different story, and you have the ability to access and heal in ways that maybe that parent never did because you're even just watching a video like this, right? So at the end of the day, I think it's incredibly difficult to heal these things. And like I said, I mean, here I am I did weekly therapy for a really long time. I've been doing therapy twice a month for the last couple of years, honestly, because it's expensive, and I get that. And I haven't been raising my kids and trying to build my, career and all of that. But it has been such an anchor for me. And even though we revisit a lot of the same topics, I sometimes say to her, I'm sorry, no, we're not done with this topic. And I don't know when we're going to be. It's still evolving and growing. Even when I had that video I just made about the motherless thing I just shared, something shifted in me in just the last 2 weeks since I had that session and I made that video. And sometimes when I make videos, it's just about things I think about with work, and there's not a lot of connection. But most of you who watch my channel know that I try to bring parts of my own story in, and I'm working through stuff just like I'm sitting here talking about it, or while I'm talking about it, just like you might be while you're watching this, or someone else's great videos here on the channel or TikTok, or reading great books or whatever. So it takes a lot of time. It is not about just doing things. But there are things like DBT skills, distress tolerance, which is basically that, mindfulness skills, learning how to regulate emotions, like all of that. There are things you can do. And I would say, as you've heard me say so many times, things like exercise, cardio, getting sleep, looking at how your basic self-care will impact your mental health, honestly, in ways you could never imagine. Just not sleeping enough, let alone things like menopause or autoimmune diseases, gastrointestinal illnesses, you name it, right? So just don't, try to do the things, but also keep leaning into the work. Take a break when you need to, but just keep going. And if you keep going, I do believe that more and more you begin to heal. And so that's it. I know this is kind of a longer video, but I was going to have 2 videos to do this, but I thought, no, I really wanted to connect what I think the common struggles are with how to work on healing. So thank you for being here. I'll list some books down below that I think are really helpful. You can also go to my website. The drkimsage.com has a page of book references. I should probably update that one. It's been a little while, but there's some great ones that I still continue to use. So please stay safe and well, and I'll see you soon.